Hello and welcome to Health and Wellness, your guide to the integrated personal and financial retirement journey for physicians. I'm your host, Michael Swartz, Certified Financial Planner and Master Certified Physician Development Coach. Welcome back to Health and Wellness. We are in episode 2 with Dr. Gita Mehta. And Gita, I think the first conversation, it was overflowing with vulnerability, authenticity, and just sharing your story. And I want to start by just thanking you so that the listeners will also hear your story and understand that this doesn't have to be a linear path. There really is no right answer, and reality in life is going to have a say in this retirement journey. And just wanted to start by thanking you for being so vulnerable in that first conversation.
Well, thank you, Michael.
And as a coach now, I know you see this with mid-career physicians. You mentioned it in your own retirement journey. But in this conversation, I'd really like to talk about the role that coupling up of identity in physicianhood has on the individual, and how you went about processing that and what it felt like for you. So could we do a little bit? Could we talk a little bit about the identity and the role that plays in the retirement journey for physicians?
Sure.
So for you specifically, for those of you who listened to last week's episode, you really didn't have much of a say in when you chose to retire. It was really brought on by your mom's health and traveling back to India to care for her. And you did get to kind of continue that role of being a physician for your mom. But once your mom passed away and then your dad afterwards as his caregiver, the role of being a physician and a caregiver was completely absent in your life. I'm curious what that brought about for an awareness when it comes to your identity as a physician.
It was very strange. If I would ask people, can I still call myself doctor? And people would say, oh, once a doctor, always a doctor. But it didn't sit right. And I think that, a career where this is the only work you've done all your life. You've gone to medical school, straight out of medical school, you get a job, residency, fellowship, faculty. Of course, I had a lot of other identities, but this was the identity you lived with on a daily basis. And people called you doctor all day long. And, it was losing that identity was sort of like, I have to figure out who I really am if I'm not a doctor. And I think that was a challenge. I was still a mom. I was still a wife. I was a friend. I, was an aunt. But none of those felt enough. It felt like, of course, my role is to support my family, and I'm still doing that. What else am I? And it was difficult for me to figure out, almost like, who do I want to be when I grow up? It's like staring me in the face now. Who do I want to be? And I had to fall back on, what are the qualities I like of myself? What are my values that I want to continue? What do I feel are my strengths that can take me forward? And what do I want to build upon? Who do I want to be? And even naming those things to myself took time. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the challenges of losing one's identity is it really is a disorienting place. You get to this point where it doesn't feel right to be called doctor. And some physicians will retire and say, no, God darn it, once a doctor, always a doctor. And others will say, well, if I'm not practicing medicine, even for you providing coaching to some of these mid and early career physicians, it's the role of a coach, not necessarily practicing medicine. And so you had mentioned this in some of our conversations ahead of time, but the concept that, when you get to retirement and your practice in medicine ends, it's almost preparing for your own death. There's a death of that role. And you mentioned, the ones that survive are the role of mother or spouse or aunt. We have all these external roles outside of ourselves. But what about that sense of self and identity when inside of us, where I am a doctor becomes, well, I'm a retired doctor. What does that feel like?
Uh, it sits well now. And as one of my colleagues used to say about recovering, so I'm a
Hmm.
recovering internist now. So, and I can say by now, 7 years later, I have recovered. And it's funny how I can almost look back at my career and think of that as happening to somebody else because it feels so distant from who I am now. And I can even look at it fondly. I mean, despite uh, you know, when you're in it, all you can think about is all the work that needs to be done and, missing the forest for the trees kind of situation. And now I can say, yes, these were the highlights and and celebrate those instead of thinking, oh my God, that was so much work. I was so burnt out. I never had time for myself, not enough time for the family. And that's all you recall, all the problems with the healthcare system. But I think I'm removed enough that um, it's in a good place now.
Well, let's talk about that then, Geeta, because it sounds like you've got grace. It sounds like you've got some understanding and maybe reframing a little bit with that distance. That time gives us perspective. And the further removed from it, the more we can maybe revisit and potentially reframe some of our experiences. Yes, there were negative elements. And with a negativity bias, human beings are very well equipped to know what they're retiring from when they
Right.
retire from a career in medicine. But I'm curious, when did you decide, or when did it become apparent that celebrating these milestones of your career was a valuable part of processing this retirement transition?
I think I think it happened when I finally found myself in a good place now that I could reflect on that. It's when I was still in the grieving process. Um, it was all about my loss. It was all about, um, sure, it was a lot of grunt work, but the this the community with other physicians and the nice feedback you got from students or how the patients appreciated what you did, I lost all that.
Mm.
And so it was a matter of, okay, but it's fine, but that was a past life and now I'm moving into something else which is rewarding as well. So then I think the transition happened maybe I'd say a year or so ago.
Okay. Because I'm really curious on the timeline here because I think a lot of folks are going to get to retirement and maybe expect just a smooth transition into. And, I heard you say 6 months is not enough time to go through the process of retiring, of rediscovering the values, identity, purpose beyond outside of your career. And it sounds like it could take anywhere from 5 to 10 years to really process for some of these more acute experiences before you really start to feel that same sense of purpose and identity and values aligned life.
Yeah.
And so for you, what does that timeline look like?
I think things started moving faster, and I'm sure it's so different for different people. I mean, I have colleagues who've sort of jumped out of retirement straight into something else 3 months later, built another career, are perfectly satisfied and happy. And I don't know how much they even felt a loss of the previous life as physicians. So it's got to be so individual based on how it happens. And of course, a planned retirement goes so much smoother, because there is no sense of loss. Because for me, it was like the grieving that we spoke about. Um, I had to come to terms with that first.
Mhm.
While if you do it as a planned way, you pick a date or age and you decide to retire, it's a much smoother path.
Well, it's a bit maybe I would say it akin to many physicians, like having children, where an unplanned pregnancy might feel a bit rushed, but there's also no right time to do it. You will never be totally ready to become a parent. And
Right.
yet, along the way, it always seems to work out. And so maybe a little bit more planning on the front end will give you a little bit more peace of mind as you approach the date and choose to transition.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wonderful. And so, Geeta, I would love your perspective too on this whole concept of something to retire to, because you did, in theory, have something to retire to, but both of those roles for your caregiver for your mom and then again for your dad, both of those things went away. And it was really at that point that the true sense of directionless and uncertainty, it sounds like, set in. And so how did you go about rebuilding where you are today to really have that purpose motivated life that you've now fully retired into?
Yeah. Um, I still think it took a lot of reflection. And I think after my father passed away, that was much harder because after my mother passed away, it was like, okay, now I have to make sure he's okay. And I would go back to India for 3, 4 times a year, spend a month or so at a time. And after he passed away, I had to really face reality in terms of what I wanted to do and figure out for myself, which took a lot of soul searching, a lot of reading, a lot of conversations with my husband, and of seeing what it could look like. And and I think some of it is there's a bit of fear. I had a lot of fear in how could it look like? Do I want to be so successful that I don't have time for my family? And uh, I don't want to compromise on that. I compromised on family for, all my career. And do I still want to do that? And how do I find something which gives me some autonomy of my time and how I spend it? So I can't really take on a job which is requires my 100% presence. What is that going to look like? And where do I still have time for pursuing the other things that I enjoy? So it took as almost like a balancing act of picking and choosing things and writing down, what makes sense and what makes me feel creative and alive.
Well, I thought you might go here, but I'll prompt you anyway. You mentioned finding the sweet spot. So for you, what's that allocation of time? Because it wasn't full time. You made that clear. Surrendering your sense of agency to another full-time job was not an option. Sacrificing your family was not. So what for you is that allocation of time to your greater purpose? And then how does that allow you to still pursue some of the things that make you happy outside of a greater purpose?
I think it's about maybe 30% time. So I look at that as I spend about 4 hours a day on reading, prepping, coaching, um, preparing workshops, delivering workshops, things like that. So, and of course, it varies because if there's a crunch time and I still have that problem with it. Oh, I can do it, and then suddenly everything comes together, and you're working 8 hours a day to get everything ready for the 3 workshops which are next week. So, but I would say on an average, about 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours a day.
Okay. Wonderful. So for you, you've really, it sounds like, taken over the ownership of your schedule and said, I'm willing to commit up to this amount of time. That's been a personal choice. So it's not like you said yes to every opportunity that came along. In fact, it sounds like, did most of this intentionally and really rebuilt the framework of your life from the ground up to create this fulfilling and retirement that provides you enough sense of structure and purpose that it's fulfilling, but enough freedom so that it can be enjoyable too.
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, Geeta, I want to just celebrate that with you. Congratulations. It sounds like it's been a long road, a long uphill climb to really go through that trial and error period to build up a life that now I see you glowing in the face here for the folks listening on the audio only. It's phenomenal to see where you started in your retirement journey and where you're at today. And I think there will be a lot of people who can project out ahead of themselves and see themselves in your journey and say, okay, here's what I can do ahead of time so that I don't have to process so many things simultaneously. I guess what would you like to share with those folks who are thinking about or contemplating their own retirement or at least starting the process of defining themselves outside of their career? What's some valuable advice that you have for them?
I think the first thing is get used to the idea of not being a doctor anymore. A lot of some colleagues will just do part-time work, and that's fine. You can still call yourself doctor if that satisfies you. But if you're looking at a career outside medicine, and not just downsizing what you do, it's a shift. It's a mental shift, which takes time. And I think the other thing that I would say is spend more time figuring out who you are and who you want to be. Because I don't think in our busy lives we ever spend enough time doing that. And if you want to be authentic to yourself, it's a lot of work.
I love that. So an invitation to do that deeper work, to hold that space and go a little bit deeper. You mentioned, there's roles outside of ourselves, and I think that's a wonderful point to end on here. Is yes, you will still be a spouse, a mother, an aunt, a daughter, but those roles aren't our identity. They aren't our internal sense of purpose. And having that purpose and identity kind of founded on our individual values, that's where that sense of peace comes from. That's where that sense of purpose is derived from to really lay the blueprints or provide guidance for designing the life beyond medicine.
Absolutely.
Well, Gita, I want to thank you just once again for your vulnerability, your authenticity. I know this isn't an easy story to tell, but I'm absolutely confident that the folks that are going to hear this will be able to see a bit of themselves in this story and get started sooner and get used to not being called doctor, because that time will come. And so we had talked about this in our conversations outside of the podcast too, but a story from one of the hospice physicians here in La Crosse. He said, with a lot of my patients, I noticed that they weren't really talking about their end of life, and it almost felt as if they didn't address it or talk about it, it wouldn't be true. And just to be able to have these conversations is very empowering, because he then recognized in himself he was doing the exact same thing about his retirement. Well, if I just don't think about it, I just don't talk about it, it's not going to happen. And I think your story really shows that reality will have a say in our retirement journey. In fact, sometimes it will force the retirement before we're ready. And so if that's not an invitation to get started sooner, to start having these conversations and really rebuilding that sense of identity, and it starts with just having those conversations. And so thank you for being the voice of retired physicians and retiring physicians. It will happen. And
Yes.
so we might as well get some work done ahead of time to make it a more palatable transition.
Yes. Thank you, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you, Gita.
Mhm.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Health and Wellness Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Michael Swartz, Certified Financial Planner and Master Certified Physician Development Coach. If you're looking for additional resources for integrated physician retirement planning, please visit healthandwellness.com. We'll see you in the next episode.